Something I love about roguelikes as a genre is the sheer variety and experiences it can offer, especially nowadays. While the genre itself focuses on a few core tenets such as putting gameplay first, high replayability, and RNG based runs, we are seeing subversions of these tropes with each new game that comes out. But I'm not here to talk about those games. I'm here because I want to discuss one of the lesser known games that came out in March of 2020 that I think is still worthy of discussion and analysis to see how it fares in the sea of roguelikes. My name is Pyrals, and this is a review of One Step from Eden. One Step from Eden is a fast-paced, deck-building roguelike created by Thomas Moon Kang and published by Humble Bundle on March 26, 2020. The game's origins trace back to a successful month-long Kickstarter campaign in 2019. With Kang standing as a solo developer, he's responsible for all the game's design, programming, and vast majority of the visuals, animation, and sound design. Though other artists were contacted to fulfill stretch goal rewards and give the game an extra layer of polish with a full soundtrack, full CG art sequences, and additional pixel art for characters and backgrounds. To give a small idea on where I stand with this game, I think this game is fantastic, but there are little bits and pieces that keep it from being pure roguelike bliss. My opinion is formed after 50 plus hours of game time and unlocking nearly all the content the game has to offer, though I wouldn't be surprised if I missed one or two things. In order to get a clear example of where I'm coming from, I feel it's best to start with explaining the systems of the game and then go forward one step at a time. Groan-inducing puns aside, and I'm sorry I had to squeeze that in somewhere, I feel the systems are the best part of the game. There's a lot of things to cover and I'm going to do my best to explain and show where the systems shine the brightest, and then from there I hope to show where I think these systems lack a bit. The goal in One Step from Eden is to reach the titular namesake after battling through 8 different levels. You do this by traveling down randomly generated paths and fight enemies, rescue hostages, and beat a boss at the end of the path. Throughout your journey, you'll collect cards that serve as your form of progression. You start with a predetermined set of cards that are decided by your character choice and loadout. Each character has one additional loadout from their default, which drastically alters how they handle encounters, offering different starting cards, weapons, and build-defining artifacts. Movement is done in a 4x8 grid, with you taking one half and enemies taking the other. You can move at any time in one of the 4 cardinal directions, and the game will make sure you stay moving as tougher enemies and bosses come with attacks that can hit multiple tiles at once, or some in rapid succession. Mana is your universal resource that slowly recharges over time. Each spell has its own individual mana cost, and almost all can be cast on the move unless they have the keyword Anchor. Keywords are additional mechanics that can apply to spells that augment how they interact when cast. Some spells are consumed upon use, meaning they can't be used until the next battle. Some require to be channeled, and some will root enemies. There's obviously more to this, but if you're genuinely curious, here's a screen of all the keywords found in the game if you want to pause and read them. Character and loadout choice determines how much mana you start with and how quickly it regenerates on its own, though you can commonly find increases to your mana pool and regeneration with artifacts. For example, choosing someone like Terra will steer you towards cards in the Hearth tree, as these types of spells focus on the keyword Break, where tiles are unable to be stepped on for a period of time. This can be a problem normally since the game focuses hard on movement, but thanks to her Moonstone artifact, every broken tile feeds into her mana regeneration, meaning the more tiles that are broken, the faster you can sling your spells. Artifacts really are the crux of your deck. You get one as a reward for leveling up and for killing bosses. The effects they offer range in complexity, with most offering an incentive for creating a deck archetype. Cards and artifacts follow a typical rarity scale, with common being the most easily found, and legendary being the most powerful and game-changing effects. Take something like Ninjutsu, a legendary artifact that gives you a 50% chance to add a kunai to your deck after hitting a target with a kunai. Getting something like this early on, while super rare, pretty much decides how you're going to play the rest of the run. You set your focus to Slashfic, the magic type that kunai falls under, take cards that generate kunai like Double Take, Collect Ring, and Swipe, and since kunai do not cost any mana to cast, you can abuse artifacts like Bismuth, Amethyst, and Dart Frog. All of it to create a horribly powerful deck that can shred through just about any challenge the game can throw at you. It's decks like these that make me feel the systems are the best part of One Step from Eden. That previous example is just one type of kunai deck, meaning that there are other ways to build it. Variety is the spice of life after all, and it doesn't really take long before you find spell schools and archetypes that you enjoy using. When I first started, I was a huge fan of Hearth, not so much for the break mechanic, but because of one of the second keywords they have, flow. Flow causes an extra effect if the previous card you cast had flow. Combine this with most of Hearth spells being very hard hitting and very low cast, it was very easy to find some spells I really enjoyed using. Some examples of some good spells were Coldstone, which would throw a Frostbolt if it had flow, and Fracture, because what's better than one hard hitting rock? Two of them for the exact same cost. Despite my praise for the system, it still has its issues, primarily with its overall flexibility. You see, Eden lacks the ability for the player to pivot their strategy into something else. This is an issue because you can get artifacts and spell drops that can create those game-breaking archetypes, but they don't work with the deck you already have with at the time. If you want to remove certain cards or artifacts from your deck, you need to use removals. These can only be acquired through Shopkeeper at a restricted 1 per visit, and there's a chance it can show up as an artifact drop when killing a boss, but only a chance. To see where this is a problem, let's reuse that kunai example again, but instead change when we get the deck defining ninjutsu from early on in the run to midway through the run. If we already had an archetype like Jam going on at this point, we now need to make a beeline for every visit to Shopkeeper in order to drop our Jam cards, since that archetype doesn't mesh well with kunai. Even if we were to visit Shopkeeper as much as we can, we're looking at 4 to 5 removals at the most, perhaps a few more if we got lucky with artifact drops. For the amount of removals you get in Eden, deck sizes get pretty large, with one spell being rewarded to you after each room. Most decks usually end up somewhere around the 20 to 30 card mark. It's not quite the 2,000 card shuffle Yu-Gi-Oh deck pre-deck limitation rules, but only having 4 to 5 removals means you'll probably only be able to take out your starting cards, if that. Without a reasonable way to thin out your deck should you make a mistake or wish to change things up mid-run, you don't really have that option available to you. You stick with what you get early and hope the game gives you enough powerful tools in order to tackle the later half of the game. And if that deck just doesn't come together, there isn't really much you can do about it. You kind of have to try again and hope you get better RNG this time. Now, this is remedied over time by playing the game more, but that can apply to any roguelike. The better you get at it, the more risks you can take and the more crazy deck ideas you can have. I don't have the best way to segue into this, but I know that if I didn't talk about it, somebody else would mention it. But the obvious inspiration for this game, from the grid-like movement, deck building strategy with a focus on action, even down to Saffron's Field Bracer, comes from a spin-off of Capcom's Mega Man Battle Network. Unfortunately, I can't offer any sort of deep comparisons, as I've never really played the series, but in just getting a little bit of footage for this video, I found a few surface-level observations. Battle Network is a bit slower paced and leans more on the typical strategy you find in any regular card game. Every time you empty your chips, you have to wait to pull new ones, whereas in Eden you shuffle your spells back into your deck and you can do so manually. Once you do get to select new chips, the game pauses while you make your decision, so the challenge is more focused on building the perfect deck and finding synergies with the chips you pull. And since this is an RPG, grinding for chips, zenny, and experience points is an option if encounters are too hard. Eden is a roguelike, so progress is not saved each run. The only thing that happens after you finish a run or die is that you gain a selection of random unlocks. Sometimes it's characters, but most of the time it's artifacts and cards you may encounter on your next run. Maybe. It's entirely up to how RNG is feeling that day, and the only way to make encounters easier is to simply keep trying to beat them. Let's take a moment to talk about the characters and their loadouts, as they're the other big decision you'll make before jumping into a run. Some specialize in different magic schools, others focus on weapon damage, and some have their own gimmick that puts them in more of a niche category. Once again, the variety shines through, but there's a rigidity to these characters as well, and I find that the worst parts of the system show up when you decide to choose a character that solely focuses around one type of magic. Slicey's base loadout, while not bad, is a good example of this, as it revolves solely around Frost, a mechanic that causes a good chunk of damage if you can hit an enemy 3 times with Frost-based spells. What this means is that you're going to want to take cards that interact with Frost as much as possible. But if the game decides not to give you those deck-defining cards or artifacts for Frost-based damage, then you may end up getting pulled in too many directions at once and fail due to an overbloated deck. On the flip side, if you do get lucky and manage to get powerful Frost artifacts like Cold-Blooded, Cryophage, and the all-powerful Doublemint, then suddenly Slicey is slicing and dicing all across the battlefield while weaving in her spells with ease. I could go further into the other characters, and not all of them are as extreme as that, but the point is that while the variance is very nice to have, the rigidity in how you have to play some of these loadouts can make it too polarizing. Coupled with the fact that not every character has the same health pool, this makes default Saffron one of the best characters from the get-go. Though her starting spells aren't the best, she can specialize into any type of magic, has a consistent source of damage from her field bracer that can further be upgraded with the proper artifacts, and a free revive to half her health the first time she goes down. Compare this to Bullet Hell Gunner, who has little to no mana regeneration, a single spell to start, and though his cannon can do damage if you get close to an enemy, your measly 400 health will stop you from taking that risk often. This loadout is an obvious reference to bullet hell games that have a similar idea of low health, a single bomb used to clear the field, and a decent weapon, but at least in those games I can upgrade my weapon to ludicrous degrees, and I usually have some sort of evasion or invulnerability maneuver. This just doesn't translate as well. This game's hard, like really hard. It took me around 10 hours in order to get my first win on the easiest final boss, only to have the game glitch and kill me anyway. The difficulty of this game can be boiled down into two things: the initial information given to you and its boss design. Eden, to me, has a higher barrier of entry compared to most roguelikes. This is because the tutorial is very bare bones and leaves out some important information with its enemy design. Every enemy outside bosses has a set pattern of behavior, and I mean a set pattern of behavior. Revolvers will always walk in a jazz square between attacks. Invaders will always sit for a bit before jumping to your side of the battlefield and trying to slice where you last were. And the wonderfully named Bomber Boys will sit still, throw their bomb in the air, and cast Kinetic Wave to push it over to your side. Nothing else. The only thing that adds variation is the tier of enemy, which has a higher chance of spawning depending on how high your luck stat is. Though to compensate for this, luck also increases the odds of finding good cards and artifacts. This stat goes up naturally during a run and can be further raised with artifacts, or, if you want to be cruel about it, you can butcher this little bunny whenever you go to a campsite. Sorry, little guy. Of course, most of this information is learned organically through repeated runs. I wouldn't want a big sign that shows up at the beginning of the game that says, "Hey, this is all the things you need to avoid from now on." But that initial hump of difficulty usually comes from some of the harsh early lessons you'll learn along the way. Let's take the reactor for example. It only attacks when you cast a spell by jumping to the opposite square of where it is and throwing a fireball where it last was. On its own, it's not too scary, but when it's shoved into a group of enemies, you don't have time to commit its actions to memory when you're starting out. The Avenger sends out a projectile whenever you hit it with anything. Once again, on its own, it's a non-issue, but since your first runs will most likely be with Saffron, with her fast-hitting field bracer, something like this is bound to happen. When spawning into a room of different enemies late into the run, you have to learn what enemies to prioritize over others so you don't end the battle worse off than when you began. On top of that, because of how many cards and types are available to you, it can lead to a bit of an overload of information early on. If you took every card and have a Flow, Trinity, Kunai, Poison, Frost based deck, then congratulations, I would love to see that work, but you might have trouble when you reach a late game boss, as time spent fumbling over your cards is time that can be taken to damage the boss or avoid their attacks. To give credit where it's due, there are some great steps towards accessibility that Eden takes. Small videos showcase how spells will interact when you hover over them in the rewards screen. Keywords are bolded and always have their description appear alongside them, and if that card creates another one, then that card shows up as well when selected. But I think some extra instruction on enemy patterns and some tips on deck construction could help make this process feel a lot smoother early on. Like I said, the tutorial is very bare bones, so if the game started the first run with a specific enemy, it could tell the player to watch for enemy movement and attack patterns. Now that may sound patronizing at first, but the later half of the game can get so chaotic that knowing how rigid the AI is would have saved me a few whiff spells and even a few runs. A deck building tutorial is a bit different and varies from person to person. Thankfully, since mana is an endless resource, concepts like playing on curve or typical deck archetypes like control, mid-range, or aggro don't really apply here. But a small tutorial after the plan fight that showcases cards that synergize with your starter deck could plant a seed in the mind of the player to keep their eye open for cards that work well with their strategy. Another seed it could plant is showing a set of 3 cards that don't do anything for your deck. Then it could instruct the player that it's not always best to take every single card you're given. Since you don't have to worry about deck sizes and running out of cards in Eden, it's best to have a consistent strategy over one that leaves too much up to chance. I understand that at the end of the day, a game's a game, but if you'll excuse me for getting a little bit pedantic, I feel that Eden metaphorically is like a dance, and the game is the one leading you along. It expects you to take every little dip, spin, lunge, and step it throws at you, and then if you can't keep up, the game will not hesitate to slap your wrists, then ask you to do it again. But do it better. This game's frantic, and it's constantly keeping the pace up without giving you much of a chance to breathe during the gameplay. You have to multitask your movement, the types of enemies being thrown your way, the cards you have lined up in your deck, and how much mana you have so you're not left standing around to cast the next spell. What I like about this constant multitasking is that it can put you into an almost zen-like state where you're both focusing and not focusing at the same time. There's an addictive rhythm to it all, of dodge, position, cast, repeat, that can scale up and down depending on your type of deck that you build. The problem with this design, though, is that when you slip and stumble and that rhythm is thrown off, one mistake can lead to several as you scramble to try and get your footing back. But when you manage to overcome the odds in a pinch, or pull off a really tricky maneuver you didn't even know you were capable of, there's no greater accomplishment. If you haven't noticed yet, one step from Eden's bosses are the other characters you can play as in the game. Each one belongs to a certain tile set and gain increased health, defense, and damage as the run goes on, adding additional attacks or modifiers to existing ones once you reach the halfway point of 4-0. Part of that difficulty curve is knowing which bosses should be taken out as soon as possible and which ones you can save for the end. I found that leaving Terra and Riva up for the last 2 levels is like taking your good run out to the back to put her down gently. These two do not let up when you reach the end of your run, and it's basically expected that your decently built deck can end the fight in the first minute or so. Riva summons adds, puts up reflector shields to block your spells and bounce them back to punish fast casting, and has those diagonal diamonds that can go straight back to hell where they came from, because trying to dodge a diagonally moving projectile while also trying to avoid the road she casted it on with only the 4 cardinal directions for movement is hard. Not to mention that this attack has almost no cooldown, so if she wants to, she can simply keep spamming it relentlessly. And whatever you do not get her down to half health and run out of steam to finish her off, because bosses speed up and start chaining attacks over and over once they reach that point. Terra suffers from similar difficulty spikes. She even has her own diagonal attack, but it only takes up 4 squares rather than half the battlefield. Early on, I felt that in order to get through her, you had to take Flat Earth, a spell that can repair the ground and get that reclaimed space back as a shield. But in her defense, at least when she's doing her attacks, she stays almost completely still, so when you have a moment to damage her, you can really put in some numbers before going back to dodging. Nowadays, I really enjoy her fight. I feel that she brings out the dodge, position, cast, repeat dance cycle the best. It's not all bad though, as Violet, Hazel, and Shiso rarely put up a fight even after the halfway point of 4-0. Shiso's only mechanic is that his revolver will cause you to forcibly shuffle and gain 2 jams. Hazel summons turrets and structures that need to be blasted through, but their health is pretty low and she herself is a bit of a pushover. And finally, Violet begins her battle by making you play a rhythm game. Hey, talk about that dance metaphor again. Which gives you free reign to damage her while gaining a beefy shield. Most of the time the fight's over before the second phase, which is a shame because her design and theme is really, really good. In fact, let's take a moment to discuss the aesthetics before we continue, because I have to say, I love the aesthetic of this game. The character and ending CGs were illustrated by Star Soul Art on Twitter, and I'm a huge sucker for full key arts for characters, even if they're in a pixel style. It gives these characters a larger-than-life feel, since I've always associated pixels with looking at something from far away. Now, I know this next test is a bit of a meme, and it isn't really a huge deciding factor of good or bad character design because it can go both ways, but when I take each of these key arts and put them into a silhouette, I love that I can still recognize who they are and a few of their core details. Riva's shield, Hazel's hammer and wrench, even Saffron's cards and Violet's bow can all be seen clearly, and to me, that accounts for something. I'm not really an artist, but I have a huge respect for the medium, so maybe I'm just easy to please. While enemies don't have key arts, their sprites are fairly unique, and some do reflect the zone they come from with different color variations for higher tiers. While I think the creatures and machines look good in their sprite form, I do have to admit the humanoid sprites are a bit on the lanky side. This also applies to the character's default look. It's not terrible, but when I look at Riva's large shoulder pads, heavy armor, and light green hair, I can't help but feel like her sprite's the Riva we have at home. And this is where we're going to pause the video just for a second, and while this is going to date it even more, as if that, have at home joke is really doing it justice, this needs to be mentioned. On August 19th, we learned that all the characters' default sprites are going to be replaced with the cleaner updated sprites by James T, so this point is now moot. This doesn't apply to the alternative outfits you unlock, as they were a stretch goal during the game's Kickstarter campaign, and they're all great quality. I personally love Shiso's Desperado costume, with the way the hat flies in before revealing him. That's really cool. The effects and spells, though, are where the pixel animation really shines. The way Ragnarok forms into a blade before striking, the sheer size of Teleport Beam as it bounces enemies all over the place, and how every spell school has a number of distinct colors that they rarely deviate from, creating a sense of cohesion even with so many spells to choose from. I feel like this is a bit of a given for roguelikes, but the music in this game is also really damn good. It was composed by Steel Plus, with Michael Kelly coming in as a guest composer, and the combination of chiptune with real instrumentation creates a unique sound profile that's upbeat and catchy, but carries a lot of weight with powerful piano and violin accompaniment. It knows when to be calm, blood pumping, and even morose. Some of my favorite tracks are Violet's Neverending Song, Saffron's Drawing Dead, and even the main menu's track, Prelude. I even enjoy how the victory theme changes based on whether you cleared the room flawlessly, or not. Now let's take the last part of this video to discuss the final bosses, the morality system, and the endings. Upon defeating a boss, you're left with two major decisions. You may either spare them, which gives you a good chunk of health back, or decide to kill them to reap extra rewards. Now, this morality system isn't exactly breaking any new ground, but I find it relatively harmless. Both options affect your gameplay, no matter what decision you make. Sure, you could take the extra rewards, but granting these characters mercy will allow them to help you in their own way. Violet will give you a spell power and shield buff. Riva gives you one free revive for the rest of the run. Terra will break a few tiles? Look, I know that's her thing, but Saffron just shows up and Ragnarok's the nearest enemy, and that usually kills them most of the time, so what the hell, Terra? So this means that there are 3 different types of runs in Eden: pacifist, neutral, and genocide, and the only difference that I found is that the final boss changes based on what type of run you're doing. So let's assume you're like me and you hate making pixels on a screen feel bad because you hate conflict and decide to keep everyone alive as you went to Eden. Then the final boss will be against Terrible. I'm not making a pun here, that's literally her name. It's implied that she's some other half of Terra, or it's one big love letter to the game Celeste, but I'm more shocked about her glow up she's gotten between patches. What the fuck? Terrible is difficult, but she's definitely the easiest out of the final bosses, mostly due to having the lowest health pool. I don't think I've ever perfected this fight, but since you've been sparing everyone, you should have a full health bar, and if you mess up, Riva will be there to save you at least once. That's not to say Terrible isn't tricky in her own way. Taking a page from Invaders, she occasionally jumps over to your side, making it difficult to hit her, and the corresponding explosion attack can trip you up if you have to move diagonally. But even her wide-hitting attacks have large telegraphs, and even her diamond laser attack does not hold a candle to Riva's. Just about any deck works against her, so commit her patterns to memory and she'll go down no problem. But in a last-ditch effort to put you down for good, Terrible throws out a blast that immediately knocks you down to 1 health and leaves you stunned. But, even if you used her during the fight, Riva comes in to save you from the last blast, and everyone you helped along the way decides to band together using the superpower of teamwork to put her back into the ground. But with Terrible on the ground, you're left with your final decision. Do you hold to your virtues and decide to let her live? Or do you decide at the last minute that Mercy's too kind even for her and silence her forever? Both offer different achievements, and both offer slight changes in the ending, which I'll let you see for yourself right here. Something I really like about this ending is not only having a final choice, but how there's a good attention to detail in these ending CGs. Though the shadow that approaches Terrible is always circular, the hand that reaches down to help her up is different depending on what character you've selected. Another detail is how if you're playing Riva and you defeat Terrible, Saffron's the one to save you instead. And finally, the little artwork on the credits is different depending on whether or not you chose to save Terrible. But no matter what choice you make, thanks to Terrible opening up the gate, you and your friends you've made along the way can enter together. Congratulations, you've made it to Eden. However, if you decide to do a mixture of killing and sparing, then the end result just isn't as good. Upon arriving at Eden, instead of Terrible being there to blow up the gate, she just misses the memo or something? Perhaps her alarm clock didn't go off. And don't give me this whole, oh, well, you killed Terra, probably killed her too, crap, because even if you spare Terra during her fight, Terrible still won't show up, which really leaves me with more questions than answers. To the game's credit, it is pretty cool to force your way into the city yourself, as Gate here is the only boss that takes up more than one square. This oversized garage door, however, comes with the largest health pool in the game, and is just one large DPS check. This is because it spawns multiple turrets and lasers that can only be stopped if you just hit it hard enough. This fight is really polarizing for me, because most of the spells you take in the game are really designed to hit one or two opponents max. This turns the fight into one big button mashing fiesta, throwing aim out the window in favor of trying to kill it before it kills you. On the flip side, if you remember to take some important area of effect spells like Firewall, Glaive, Shine, Diag Beam, among others, then this fight becomes downright trivial. While the uniqueness of this fight is something I can appreciate, the damage sponge nature of it all just makes it fall flat for me. There isn't even an ending CG like in the pacifist run. Instead of being able to go inside, you're interrupted by a seraph who speaks in serif font named Seraph. I don't even have a quip about this, I just think it's funny. Seraph decides that someone who messes with people's lives as they see fit is not allowed to enter Eden and just one-shots you for your trouble. No other fanfare, you just go on the results screen like any other run you've died with the cruel message of being quite literally one step from Eden. So, we have our target. The only way to get revenge on that oversized turtle dove is if you're pure of heart, but less in the do good things way and more about how I react to any minor inconvenience, by way of burning it all to the ground. You're going to save everyone by killing everyone. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 total murders before reaching the final boss nets you a journey into the city itself for one last level, featuring a new tile set along with a slew of new enemies that haven't been encountered at all up to this point. Cornets take a page from Salici and charge 2 rows of the field. Colossi will fire bouncing projectiles and retaliate when you attack it. And Crossers will spawn turrets that fire in all 4 directions on your side of the field. I think my favorite has to be the Crusher though, not for what it does, but for the fact it looks like a guy who's just missing his face. So all we need to do is put 2 little dots right here and a big old smile. Now doesn't he just look happy to do his job? Before we head off to the final fight, I recommend visiting Shopkeeper's shop at least one more time, even if just for some upgrades and a removal. Who knows how she got here, but then again, how did she get everywhere else in the world before you do? I'm just gonna chalk it up to merchant armor, since merchants in these types of games always seem to end up in even the most treacherous areas, ready to sell you their wares. Then again, besides that brief bit about removals, I never really discussed anything about Shopkeeper and Sarah, this game's version of money. Well, I already know this video is long as hell, but to keep things brief, this kind lady in green is someone you can visit once per level. What's nice is that she offers both cards, artifacts, and upgrades that can be bought for Sarah you earned after clearing each room. I found it's best to visit her once or twice per run when you've stored enough Sarah up, as you can restock her listings for a small fee or donate some health in order to get some Sarah if you're just a bit short. If you want, you can also take on little extra challenges for a small reward, but I found these to be not worth it in most runs. You can get along just fine without them. Though, if I can say anything about Shopkeeper's design, I do have to admit I miss the table she used to carry around in her concept art. I could just imagine her, like, slapping that bad boy down or smacking people with it, but her current design is nice enough as is. With one last little pit stop, you finally reach the climactic battle with Seraph on her own turf, and in a nice twist, she opens up all 32 squares of the battlefield for you two to clash in this battle of fates. Where Gate was hard due to how large his health pool was, Sarah is difficult for all the right reasons. She has the largest variety of attacks in the whole game that can hit entire sections of the battlefield with powerful sword strikes, summoning rows of light bombs that detonate when attacked by her or you, and will push you around and force you to use all those squares now at your disposal. All of this sounds and looks hectic, but thanks to all the extra experience you've acquired by killing each of the other characters, along with having an entire extra level to play through, this fight can be over in a matter of seconds. It doesn't help that Seraph's health pool is less than half of the Gate she fights so hard to protect, and you get a few seconds before the fight starts to pump damage into her before it begins. Now, some might call that playing dirty, but if I'm a genocidal maniac, then the last thing I'm going to do is think about pulling punches on the entity that caused this conflict in the first place. And that's it. That's the end of One Step from Eden. But while the credits roll again, let's take a moment to finally talk about the narrative, which I've been avoiding up to this point for one simple reason. No, your video did not break. This is normally where I'd be showing some sort of footage of a background or show off some character bios, but the truth to this is that One Step from Eden, for all that it has going for it, does not have any kind of forward narrative. No opening text crawl, no opening CG like we see in the endings, not even a synopsis found in any of the menus. The only bits of story we find are in character interactions and character snippets while hovering over them in the menu and the endings. Unless your name is Supergiant Games, roguelikes are not known for their deep story. I'm aware of this, but even the most ambiguous and gameplay-focused roguelikes at least have some sort of narrative to set up what we're doing and why we're doing it. Even games like Enter the Gungeon, one of the most celebrated games in the genre, has both an opening crawl and character motivation as they search for the gun that can kill the past. I know that might sound unfair, as this game was developed by only one person, but this sticking point for me is said with the best intentions. I love this game, but I felt so disappointed when I learned that there wasn't much beyond the surface, especially when one of the 4 pieces of Kang's design philosophy was to have a narrative that follows along and sets up this world. I would love to see more of this world explored. From the Kickstarter, we know that this is sometime after a large war has ravaged parts of the landscape. I'm assuming that's where the Ruins tile set comes from. But what was Saffron's involvement as a military scientist? Did she create weapons or magic that played a major part in this conflict? What was Riva's involvement? I would think with that shield and emblems on her armor, she comes from some knightly order. So who were they and what was their purpose? What do any of these characters benefit from trying to make it to Eden? Sure, it's a futuristic city and all, but some of these characters seem to have acclimated to their current environments. Who is Terrible? Are her and Terra 2 separate entities, or are they the same person? Then why doesn't she show up in the neutral path even if Terra is spared? So many questions, and there just aren't any answers. To me, I think this content was just cut or never fleshed out enough to be fully included. When your game has a morality system, something to decide the fate of the characters in this world, there should be a story that adds weight to these decisions. When your game has distinct endings, I feel that there should at least be something that we're properly ending here. It's clear that Kang knew he wanted a morality system from the start. These routes have enough differences in the raw gameplay to support this, but I do not think he thought how this would all be brought together narratively. If he did, then he decided it wasn't good enough and left it out for the full release. I don't think he didn't work on it at all, as these little lines and character interactions hint that there was something at least in the works, but perhaps it fell through, and that's a real thing of game design that happens. There's enough here in this character design, promotional art, and in these CGs to create a story around it, but we can only speculate what that might be. Well, back to Seraph. This is where the game ends, and your reward for killing everyone is you get a scene where I'm immortal, so you might be trying too hard. Hold on a second. The only way is to turn everything back? Oh, no. You've got to be kidding me. No matter what I do, she just won't die. Come on. This is bullshit. I fought my way through everyone, only to reach the very end and get denied my ending? She even sends you back to the very beginning of the run, and sure, you may have everything from before, but now every enemy is at their highest tier, and you're probably maxed out on artifacts, making the journey even tougher. This makes absolutely no sense. I killed all the characters, right? Riva, Gunnar, Salici, Hazel, Terra, Shiso, Violet, Shopkeeper. Oh no. I completely forgot about her. Shopkeeper. If you want to get the true ending, you not only have to kill everyone during that run, but you must defeat Shopkeeper, otherwise you're forced to go back and try it all again. Now there is a benefit to repeating a run. While it does put enemies at their hardest, it does allow you to pretty much fully max out on artifacts, and you can grab copies of cards that you already have. But the time I took to learn late game Riva and Terra, Gate and Terrible, and even Seraph pales in comparison to how much time it took to win against Shopkeeper. I have 56 hours on this game, and 10 of those were spent trying to beat her. Saffron's third and final loadout can only be unlocked by doing this insane run, and Shopkeeper does not show any kind of mercy. She hits hard, she hits fast, and her patterns require nearly perfect execution to survive. Like any boss, she also scales in damage, health, and defenses along with you, so it doesn't matter at what point you try to fight her during the run, there's no chance that you'll ever outscale her. After failing over and over again in a variety of ways, I had to resort to cheesing the fight, which the community found multiple ways of doing so. The first is to use a spell called Link, which will cause the Link target to take damage whenever anything else takes damage. Where this becomes Shopkeeper's kryptonite is if she decides to use her large ice pillar attack. If you can link her right before the explosion goes off, she'll do 666 damage to herself per pillar and basically one-shots herself. The problem with this strategy is that you have to get lucky in order to get Link early on enough in the run in order to use this strategy properly. Not only that, but you have to hope to survive long enough during her fight and hope her AI decides to use that pillar attack, and that you're at the right place at the right time in order to hit her with the Link and blow herself up. So the second strategy is to build an entire deck around two singular cards, Virus Spell and Deck Slam. That's right, out of the 200 plus spells available for you to use, this strategy only requires two and only those two. You see, Virus Spell is a spell that duplicates itself whenever you fire it off. So you start out with one Virus Spell, and then after you use it, you shuffle and get two Virus Spells, and it keeps duplicating over and over. The other card in this deck is Deck Slam, which deals 10 damage times however many cards there are in your deck. You have effectively turned yourself into a 2-card deck that can take out anyone if you can survive long enough to build up the pool of virus spells. The only weakness of this deck is that you're shuffling a lot, and when you shuffle, you increase the time of the next shuffle up to a cap. This deck was so strong that Kang decided to increase the shuffle times not once, but twice over the course of a few patches in order to make the flaw in this deck even larger. So the strategy is to say, screw memorization, and just pump her with as much damage as you can and hopefully kill her faster than she kills you, while using Saffron's second loadout to slow down time and buy you a few extra seconds to DPS her or avoid her largest attacks. And if you manage to keep the run going after that, whatever you do not mess up here on the Seraph fight, otherwise you have to do that all over again, and there's no guarantee you'll get the artifacts you need or the virus spell required in order to get the damage out to kill Shopkeeper. But if you manage to go against the odds and beat Seraph with everyone dead, during her little speech you unleash Yami, and finally put her down for good, leaving the throne to Eden completely empty. So, that's the end of One Step from Eden. The real ending this time, I swear. A fun, frantic, and difficult as hell roguelike that gives you a large sandbox with tons of tools to play around with, and many different ways to use said tools. Despite how hard the final bits of this game was to fully finish, I have to say I enjoyed the 50 plus hours I spent on it throughout 2020. And I look forward to seeing what Kang does in the future of game development. This is the first video I've made in a very, very long time on this channel, and I would really like to know what you think of it, as it took me, well, over a year to actually complete it, mainly because I was working full time. Again, I really look forward to seeing what Kang does in the future, whether it's with this franchise or something else entirely. There's clearly a cult following here, as Kang himself gives his Discord server a mention in the credits, and I hope I've done this game justice by him and by the fans as well. as I'm definitely one of them. Before we finish, there are a few people I want to mention who really helped me out during the process of making this video. Special thanks goes to Chromatos Dev for letting me commission him for this piece I used in the little Shopkeeper segment. He titled it, "You Can't Pay What You Owe with Money," and it was an absolute joy to animate. Please go give them a follow and check out their projects. Chromatos, a visual novel RPG with an absolute killer art style, and Sucker for Love, a visual novel where you attempt to get a smooch from the eldritch being Lynetta. Yes, that is as funny as it sounds. The second thanks I'd like to mention goes to my good friend Cloudy Pouty for letting me commission them for the little drawing of Terrible Conk the Hell Out while the neutral run goes on. They always tackle their commissions 150%, and they've been such a supportive friend throughout this whole endeavor. Please go give them a follow as well. Finally, thank you to all the people who I've talked non-stop about this project to over the last year and a half. You know who you are, whether you're the someone who introduced this game to me in the first place, or the one who stayed up with me and let me just talk my thoughts out with them late into the night. Or you're the many who took interest into this project after I talked about it with them. So thank you, I really appreciate it. But of course, the true final bit is a thank you to you, sitting in front of the screen right now watching the last few moments of this video tick away. I hope I was informing and entertaining for you. I'm not quite sure when the next video will come out, but I hope to see you back maybe sooner rather than later.